Hello, welcome everyone to this session. My name's May Abdalla, and I will be in conversation for the next hour with Monica Gagliano, who is a research associate of evolutionary ecology and author of the fantastic book, Thus Spoke the Plant, a remarkable journey of groundbreaking scientific discoveries and personal encounters with plants. So I'll give you a little introduction to our work. So presently, myself and Monica are working together on a new project for Anagram. So Anagram is an immersive studio of which I am one of the co-founders. And we make digital experiences that use technology and the human body together in a way designed to find ways in which to bring the audience into experiences that can allow us to think differently about how we frame and categorize the world. So this project that we're going to be exploring over the course of the hour is called Messages to a Post-Human Earth. And it's about the vulnerability of the human species in the context of thinking about the intelligence of plant life. It's a 40-minute sensory journey that's being designed for a botanical garden and will premiere next spring, hopefully, although I don't know where any of you are. In it, you're invited to have an encounter with a plant. And it considers what is an exchange that can happen between a plant and us. And that is really the central question of this conversation. And a little bit of background, the project began when Anagram was invited by the Adam Mickiewicz Institute to explore the life of Stanislaw Lem, who I'm sure many of you will know from his work, including the novel Solaris. So he's, not only is he a science fiction, he's really a fantastic thinker whose kind of work was very much a kind of a poetic interpretation of what it means to be human and the edges of that category. So the inspiration for the project is a particular moment in the history of Stanislaw Lem. It's the early 1980s, and he was invited to be part of a group called the Human Interference Task Force. Now, the Human Interference Task Force was led by the US Department of Energy, and it brought together a group of physicists, engineers, behavioral scientists, and writers to propose a method for communicating warnings to the future. So this is a real thing that happened. It's the 1980s. Everyone in that room would have lived through the World Wars, Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Cold War. So it was very much a question in terms of how will we create information that will outlive the human species. In that particular context, it was the question of how will we create signs that can be placed near bunkers that are housing toxic nuclear waste, the toxicity of which will outlive the human species. And the proposal that was developed by Stanislaw Lem, which was the inspiration for this project, was to work with plant DNA and to use plant DNA as a kind of parchment, a vessel for these messages of warnings. And so this idea, this kind of provocation of what message would we leave on the planet Earth that will kind of speak to what we did and what we've left behind long after the human species. So this proposition really captured our imagination in kind of thinking how would you even begin to like work with plant material to generate that kind of crisis message? And this is kind of how the collaboration with Monica began. So I'd heard of Monica's work a few years previous through the podcast Radiolab, where she was interviewed regarding her work that she'd done on plant memory. And the question of whether plants had memory felt like a key kind of starting point to this idea of, can we kind of tell our story through the plants, but also what memories were already within the plants. So I'm going to introduce Monica. Let's kind of bring her onto the screen to kind of kick off with a little bit of this context. Hello, Monica.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Mary.
Monica's in Australia, just to give a bit of context on this global conversation. So I was wondering if
pretty late
you
at night for me.
Yeah, exactly. So if you could begin a little bit by giving a little bit of background as to this kind of early experiments that you were doing with the mimosa plant, and what your kind of laboratory experiments discovered at that moment, and then we'll kind of continue to talk about the stuff that happens outside the laboratory after that.
Sure. Well, I guess mimosa has become more and more famous as time goes by, not just because of my study, but actually because I think everyone that comes across that plant seems to become obsessed with it. And I'm talking about people like Darwin and probably many before him as well. And the reason why is because this plant is one of the few that moves within our time scale. And so we can see the behavior taking place by literally watching it happen. And which I think most of us find very exciting, because she feels like almost an animal, but it's not, it's a plant. And what I was interested in was to use that plant as an entry point to ask questions that normally used to ask about animals. And of course, the process of learning and memory is one of those that we consider exclusive property of animals. And but through experimentation, what we showed with that initial study, was that plants can learn and remember as well as animals do. And the study specifically with mimosa was looking at the most basic form of learning, which is habituation. And the mimosa performed with flying colors. And not only that, but what was striking about it was that the plant was able to remember for a very long time about the experience that we offered in the laboratory. And long enough so that I ran out of time in the lab, but the plant still could have probably remember for longer than I could measure. So she has become famous as, she had many monikers before that, but I think the latest one was the intelligent plant, because of her ability to be able to remember a task and then perform it based on that previous experience, which is the idea of learning.
And why do you think it's so surprising in terms of the fact that you, through these tests, discovered that there had been the ability for the plant to remember? Could you give us a little bit of detail, like what was the actual experiment like, and what did you discover? Just a little bit of context, and then a little bit on why you think that surprised you.
Yeah, well, the experiment was very simple. As I said, we're testing for habituation, which is considered the simplest form of learning. Habituation consists in having the experience of a stimulus. In that case, in the experiment with the mimosa was getting dropped with a controlled drop. So as I always say, no plants were hurt in the process of these experimentations. So the mimosa is dropped, and this plant naturally, as an instinctual response, as a reaction to the drop, would close her leaves. and droop them even. And so in a way, she's playing dead. And but if you do that continuously, not very long is required in terms of time for the plant to realize that the drop actually, although it might feel and look scary, it doesn't have any lethal consequences. So nothing happens. Like the drop might be annoying, but nothing bad happens because of it after it. And so the plant, as you continue dropping it, the plants start reopening the leaves. Now, this plant is known for closing the leaves as a defensive mechanism, because when the leaves are closed, there are, spines that stick out. And so I guess she's becoming less appetizing to a potential herbivore that wants to eat it. So closing the leaves is a protective way for the plants to protect itself. And so by reopening its leaf while I'm still dropping the plant, is like the plant is telling me, I understood that this is actually not scary and it's not going to hurt me, even if it looks really annoying. And I wish you could stop this, but and I'm going to reopen my leaves because I understand that there is no danger here. And of course, reopening the leaves means that the plant is able to do the photosynthesis to its maximum efficiency, which otherwise would be cut down to even down to 40% when the leaves are closed. So there is a little trade-off between, like, shall I close and defend, or shall I stay open and eat light? And the plant obviously is balancing the two depending on the situation. And in this situation, the plant is demonstrating to us that I understand that this situation is not dangerous, so I'm not going to bother, and I'm just going to carry on eating light. And of course, we found differences in depending on how much light is available and how much, how risky it is to do one thing or the other. And then you go back almost a month later, and during the month we left it undisturbed. And a month later, we presented again the same stimuli of the drop-in. And the plant takes no time to show us, like, I already know this. And so it doesn't even close the leaves anymore. It just stays open because it knows exactly what that drop means. Nothing. It means nothing. So the plant needs to do absolutely nothing but carry on with its own business of eating light.
And why do you think that those findings, like, what's the kind of difficulty with that question? Because obviously when we're talking about memory and learning, it's so easy to kind of just to look at a plant and just not see a brain, and therefore kind of get confounded by, well, how does a plant know anything? How does it remember? How does it learn? Like, where is the plant brain, if that is something that we are going to believe in?
Yeah. Well, I'm actually in the process right now to start, as you already know, May, a big project which is funded by the Temperature World Charity Foundation. And it is exactly on this question of organism, not just plants, but other systems, biological system, which have no brains, no neurons, no neural network, no nothing of that kind, which we recognize as this is what we use to do certain activities and to accomplish certain tasks. And yet these other systems are able to accomplish those tasks without using those structures. So the idea is like, either those structures are actually not necessary. And this doesn't mean that they're not necessary to us. I mean, like, as a system that is based on neurons and brains, that's what we, or animals like us, use to do certain things. Like learning is one of those, memory is another. But this is not excluded. Having neurons and brains is not excluding other organisms from achieving exactly the same goal. And so we are exploring this because clearly from the data that we have already from plants, but also the slime mold or other creatures that don't have brains and neurons, they can still do the activity that we are assuming can only be done with brain and neurons. So, and I think what he's doing is, I mean, from a scientific perspective, of course, it's very interesting to just see how different systems get to the same goal. But to me, particularly interesting is the question that arises from this kind of data, because it's talking directly to our bias that sees us as the model, as the golden standard by which we measure everything else. So if we have a brain and a nervous system, then that must be the best way to achieve certain things. And those that do not have those structures must be lesser. That's the assumption or the bias that is hiding and lurking in the background. And I think that this kind of work is going to undermine just that.
And where do you think that kind of division between plant and animal and human kind of began? Like, what is the challenge when it comes to thinking about plant intelligence?
It's an old one. This one is an old bias, I think. For what I understand, we could trace it back to Aristotle. So this is like, ancient times, and potentially even before him. And but Aristotle was one of the ones that definitely divided the systems in plants, animals, and humans. And he specifically used the term sensitivity as a criteria to divide them into these arbitrary groups. And of course, plants are different from animals, and animals are different from a slime mold. And but the division that was made based on sensitivity assumed automatically that unless you are a sensitive one, which is the animal, and we are, of course, part of that, and even further up on the food chain, but unless you are a sensitive one, then you do not sense. But that non-sensing makes no sense, because everything senses. Everything needs to sense and perceive the world around to survive, to be alive. You cannot be here without sensing. So even in that, there is something quite nonsensical. But for some reason, this is we're talking about Aristotle must have been an incredibly charismatic character, because even his own students they observed certain things, and then they tried to describe them twist them in ways that would fit with what Aristotle was proposing, instead of looking at the obvious and say, oh, maybe things just don't work as you're describing them. So, and yet this character must have been so charismatic, because his influence is impacting us still after millennia. And and it's totally, from a scientific perspective, actually, it's totally not what the data show. So aside from what we would like to believe, or what we are used to believe, or what is convenient to believe, the data, so the science, does not show that to be true. And so it's time to just change our belief.
And so, yes, so Aristotle is obviously kind of part of this inability, like, you call this plant blindness, this sense that we're always in the foreground and the natural world is kind of a nice background picture. But I was thinking also in terms of, what are the challenges that you have around the kind of language that, we would then be using in terms of agency and choice, when it comes to what that looks like, if we're going to acknowledge that the kind of plant community does exist and have a kind of sensory exchange. Can you talk a little bit about the work that kind of looks not just as plants as kind of isolated individuals, but as a network?
Yeah, I mean, again, just staying strictly within the scientific realm, because these questions could be answered in many ways, and they're not necessarily the answer could be coming not necessarily just from
Mm-mm.
science, and science is just one perspective, and I want to make that clear. But even just within that one perspective, partial perspective, we know, like, again, from beautiful research, but for example, Susan Seaman's work in the Canadian forest on the Douglas fir, which I think is now quite well known because, that's where the term came of the wood wide web. And now this forest, which looks like made of many trees, is actually, it operates like a one organism, and everything is connected directly underground. And so
Mm.
suddenly the pictures that we see, this is a beautiful metaphor, I think, because what we see on the surface is many trunks and many individuals. But in fact, what you have is one system that operates as one, and everything in connection and relationship. And it's interesting because, of course, this research is now from the late 90s. And I find it interesting that there is this resurgence of research in this area. And even this work, which, from the late 90s, we are really becoming aware of it now. And so it took a while. And this is a typical story for science. It takes a while for science to actually trickle into what we call culture. And the buzz, I think, it can be a potent perspective, because then it can inspire other openings. So, I mean, this is my own bias being a scientist. There's like, we inspire other things. But I think in this case, it's true, because I see many artists now taking on that concept and wanting to express it in different ways that can reach people who needs different perspective, that is not necessarily a scientific perspective, or you might appreciate the scientific perspective, but can connect to the concept in other ways. And so this is where I think the arts in general have a pivotal role in at this time in particular, for changing our way of being.
Well, that sounds like a good moment to let's leave science then. So, you've obviously, we were discussing this earlier, you've spent 15 years as a scientist, but you have a lot of criticisms of the scientific method and, your research into how do neighboring plants, how do they perceive each other, or how are they made aware of each other, which kind of concluded that there were ways which plants may be able to communicate with each other which are not yet known by us as scientists. That's we were discussing how to conclude that there is something that you don't know is something that sits very uncomfortably in scientific research. And so what we obviously kind of would like to do in this talk is, there's obviously your experiences as a scientist, but there's also your experiences which kind of sits a little bit on the fringe of that, kind of the controversy perhaps around those things, and looking at like the risk perhaps that we have as a culture of assuming that it is science that has to give us permission to see things as they really are, especially when science is so stunted by its own kind of rigid process. So I wanted to kind of transition a little bit into some of your other experiences which you write about, because there's this beautiful balance really in your writing between the things that happen in the laboratory and the things that actually just happen when you're looking for them, which is, the challenge that we have in the design of this experience is giving someone the opportunity to try and encounter a plant. So we talked a little bit about some of the barriers to that. But I also wanted to kind of ask you a little bit about time and kind of the natural world, like some of the challenges to seeing this world as intelligent does come perhaps from, language and Aristotle, but also because of the nature of the human species and the time that we live. Can you tell me a little bit about that, and also maybe some of your like personal experiences in terms of trying to cross that divide between human and non-human time?
Well, yeah, time is a tricky thing, and the more time goes by, the less aware of time I seems to feel. Of course, in a scientific context, time can be measured, and it seems a real thing, and it's all good and it's useful. I can be here in time, but I think it's, in my experience, I found that it's very dangerous when it becomes the only space when we feel we can operate, like we are bound to time. And of course, working with plants is challenging that directly because they operate on a totally different scale, time scale. And so I think that the work with plants at a personal level has been really good for me because it has helped me to free myself a little bit of the constraints that I believed I needed to have based on time. And even just very recently, as we were chatting before we came online live, I just been in the field in a beautiful, very special place here in Australia. And I had this beautiful experience with one of the big trees, and we were just walking on the track, and suddenly I literally felt like the tree came and sit with me. And me being the little human just walking around and not having any time, I was like, we don't have time right now. And the conversation, of course, came, it was totally silent. So this is already one other obstacle for most people is like, so did he talk to you or didn't talk to you? So are you making this up or you didn't make it up? And but with me, because basically I moved on saying to the tree, we don't have time, because the rest of the group was quite far ahead. And there was only four of us kind of left a little bit behind. As we carried on the track, I mentioned to the other three people who were with me, and it's like, oh, the tree just wanted us to sit with it. And one of the people in that little group said, like, well, let's do it then. So the four of us sat under this beautiful big tree, and it seemed it was an experience for me because as I sat, I really felt the tree quite satisfied with that. And then there was this beautiful sharing, and it was like, you know, your people used to sit under me a long time ago, and then where did you go? But I'm really glad that you're back now. But we're talking about 20,000 years. That gap for a tree, like, yeah, you used to sit under me and then you for a while and then you're back. For a tree, that's nothing. But for us, 20,000 years sounds like I don't think my mind cannot comprehend what that really means. So again, the context suddenly changes. It's like a tree can remember us as humanity visiting, sitting under its shade and enjoying the shade and enjoying the presence and the relationship. And we don't even have the time to stop. Like I didn't want to stop because we don't have time. So I think that the relationship with plants it's important to teach us to free ourselves from our concept of, because we can make time. And also, what is time for? If we are not building meaningful relationship with the space and the beings, all of the others that they are sharing the space with us, then what are we doing with our time? And of course, this is also relevant to, you know, it doesn't have to be a plant. It can be also another person, another human person. And what are we doing with our time if we don't make it with relating and interchanging with other people? And I think that we were talking about it a little bit before as well, the enforced lockdown situation with the COVID kind of brought this at the forefront, that I think most people realize that actually the most thing is my relationship with the ones around me, people like human as well as plant people, because many went to their gardens and started planting, and potentially more. I think that because people to slow down, they have more time to appreciate the others that they are sharing the space with. And plants are masters of that. So, I think that relationship can teach us a lot.
So then, these experiences, you say that your book, Thus Spoke the Plant, is written in collaboration with a number of plants. And although you work in the field of ecology, you don't call yourself a plant scientist. So can you tell me a little bit about why that isn't the correct name for you, and kind of what are the associations with plant science? And then let's try and kind of dig in a little bit more into, like, how to deal with this kind of seemingly impossible reality where there can be communication between plants and humans, which I think for people who haven't had that experience, it's a bit mind-boggling. But yeah, so why are you not a plant scientist, Monica?
Well, first of all, because I wasn't trained as one, so the label doesn't apply. But that's a shortcut to the answer. I think that without respect to all of the plant scientists that are doing work and whatever it is that they're doing, it's just that much of the work that I've seen in sciences is it's kind of not what I'm interested in. And I'll explain a bit more. Work is done in terms of like pulling apart and looking at details, often for the purpose of those details in a way against the plants. And so using them so that in the context of crop, so that we can produce more, bigger, stronger, whatever it is that we need. And so it becomes a very anthropocentric perspective and a very anthropocentric positioning in relation to the plants, where the plants are there just as objects for us to use. And I don't see them as objects, and I don't want to treat them like objects, and I don't want to use any because there is no need. This doesn't mean that we can eat plants, for example, but a matter of like one relationship, a form of abusive relationship where it's just storing the other, doesn't leave the space for any voice to come out, to anything to speak. And then the other perspective, which is the one that I'm influenced with, space for these others to speak their own voice, to share whatever it is that they need to share, so that we can also share what we have, of just overpowering and controlling, because that doesn't leave any space for anyone, including it's in the human as well. Because then it's demanding the human to have to make decisions and deciding what this plant is supposed to become, when the plant was already a plant and it was already doing quite well by itself. So a lot of the research in plant science is often very manipulative and very based on physiology and genetics. And I'm not, as an ecologist, I'm interested in relationships. So I guess that's the fundamental difference, is like, and I would say I know nothing about plants. I only know what they told me and what they share with me, and that's very little compared to what I should know. So I'm quite happy to just remain unlabeled as I can manage, really. Then yeah. May, I can't hear you. There you are.
Just to talk a little about moving into the unknown, so kind of preparing ourselves a little bit to think about that. So I wanted to ask if you could explain a little bit about your research with the neighboring plants, and this question around kind of what our experiential relationship are, and the categories of testing or feeling or knowing that might not be quantifiable or measurable, discoverable even in a laboratory context. So can you tell us a little bit about the the kind of the plants that the test that you did with the kind of the vacuum sealed plants, just to set us up on this kind of question about the unknown sensory layers of plant communication.
So, well, actually, those were the very first experiments that I did with plants. And coming from an animal background, because that's where I come from as an animal ecologist, there was some question that I was surprised to see being even asked in the context of plants. And one of them, of course, was like, okay, so we know now that plants can communicate using light and, underground with chemicals and above ground with chemicals. But, coming from an system, sound is the mean of communication for pretty much all animals. So it's like, has anybody ever even checked whether plants can do the same? And has anybody even checked if they can do that is other than two things, like light and chemicals? There are so many other ways, and we ask the question. And I guess I had of coming from outside the field, but not being a plant biologist, because so that the biases that we have within our own disciplines didn't apply to me, because I didn't. So I started setting up the experiments just as if it was an animal, and but of course chili plants instead, and I concoction one inside the other. They look like matryoshka, and had sealed, and I had to test it to make sure that they wouldn't leave. And once we got them all working, the boxes were allowing me to contain within one container, have multiple compartments which were sealed from each other, where there were different species of plants. In this case, for example, I had the chilies and the basil plants, and from the companion planting literature, we know already that chili and basil are quite happy together, and are very happy to grow next to a fennel, bioaggressive in terms of chemistry. So I was wondering if the chili plants, as they're growing, they know who is growing next to them. And so the boxes went to cut off some of the different times. So, for example, some chilies were growing and they had to guess who was inside the box. I'll be able to see them. So no information, or to smell them, no chemical information. And so would they still know who was there? And the answer was very clear. Yes, they do. And the question became like, how do they know? Because we already shut down all of the signals that science knows these plants are. So using something else, what else is there? We don't know. I guess was my first foray into like, that we cannot explain. And yet the plants are definitely shows like I am totally aware of this, totally aware of what's going on, and how it's you need to pay attention, to be more open, be able to ask the right question, answer that I'm already giving you. I'm already giving you to do this, and you have to be able to find which one the question that will match my answer to you makes sense. Which of course is counterintuitive, because the science works. It's like we ask the question and then we find an answer, and instead the answer found me first, and then I had to find the question that matched it. And I guess even more recently with another experiment on a similar topic idea, is I had this experiment set up, and again I had all options controlled, and yet the plan very clearly showing me that there was something in the room with setting up experiments that they were aware and they were attracted to. And I went around the room looking for what is it that they like more than the stimulus that I'm giving. What I was giving them was water. So it's like a plant is like it's going away from water, go to this other signal that I cannot tell. And what this unknowing or not knowing became actually first is quite disturbing, because because I can't do the experiment if I can't control these, which is exactly wants. And then I had to learn to surrender to the fact that, okay, so I really don't know what's going on. And obviously I haven't asked my question right. The answer is being given. Plans are interesting, something that I didn't think of, and I don't even know what it is, and I probably cannot know what it is, because it could be, there is an infinite possibilities, and I have no idea where to actually pinpoint, oh, is this. So then to realize, actually, I don't need to know. That not part of the work, the not knowing is part of the experience. And because I don't need to I don't need to know, what I can do to incorporate this unknown into the design itself, my experience as an experimental scientist itself. And so I designed the entire experiment. I ended up eventually taking this experiment outside of the tools. And as soon as I did that and take for the same, the plants were happy and they were performing fine. I still don't know what in that laboratory space was. The plants were going that way no matter what. Their answer though was very clear. We're not doing what you want us to do because things they want to do. And once I removed that option, then they were able to something else. But I don't know what the option that there was. But obviously the choice was very clear. So there is someone there that is making that choice. There is someone there that is deciding, directing. There is someone there. That's the question. It's like, are we prepared to open ourselves up to this other someone? Because basically what I learned from that experience is that my experiment as it is now could have not been unless there was a possibility that I was prepared to include myself and the space as actors in the scene. So all of us were as part of the experiment rather than me produce knowledge and science.
Thanks, Monica. I think we're having slightly choppy audio from you at the moment, so we're just going to try. Yes, sorry. It's just Australia's extremely far away, it seems. So if you wouldn't mind just switching off your webcam, and we'll keep talking in the darkness, as it were.
Okay.
And we'll open up for questions shortly. So please do message with questions, whatever they are, in terms of kind of plant wisdom. And I think kind of before we do that, it would be good to kind of just, like the interesting thing about your work, which is also a bit of a mind-bending experience, is this kind of dovetailing between the scientific experiments that you're doing in a laboratory context, but also these encounters that you have, often facilitated through either kind of with the Aboriginal community in Australia, which I know that you're working with a lot more now, and also your encounters with numerous plants, and kind of shamanic encounters in South America. So there is this, there's this kind of double-handed way of being, which are in many ways just completely in contradiction with each other. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about, how to listen, I think, is what maybe, as opposed to how to talk to plants. And, I've brought my own little plant here, and everybody out there, if you guys can get as close as possible to whichever plant is in the vicinity, just to think a little bit about if you can tell us a bit about your encounter with the Osha plant, which was kind of a particular narrative, but also what is it that we might be able to do just to kind of open that like perception layer. We've already established that there are sensory exchanges that we can't identify in a lab context. That might be, the same experience kind of might cut both ways between both humans and plants. But where do you think we might begin just with the act of listening? And obviously, if anyone has any stories or experiences of having been able to listen or speak to a plant, please message and we'll read them out shortly. But take us, it's good we don't have the webcam. Maybe we can close our eyes for this bit.
Well, first of all, for me, spoke before as well, is like there is no such a thing as a manual for how to listen to plants. But it's good because we don't need one. I think it's actually a very simple human condition. We are beings. That's how we know our others and how we can socially bonds and relationships. And it's no different. Anything is not different. And the only difference is that we are assuming that that's not possible. And so we already closed the channel. We already closed the conversation. But if we are assuming, because it's an assumption, so why assuming the other way, assuming that it is possible and see what happens. And so whether you are into drumming and enter like a trance state through drumming, which is what I ended up doing many years ago when I was just starting to explore this area. And that's the story with the osha that you mentioned, May. A friend of mine gave me this root, and I remember when she gave it to me, she said, "Oh, this elder from the US gave me," and I just tried it. I licked it a little bit, and I said, "Oh, I know this," but I didn't know. And my friend said, "This is the osha root," and I was like, "I never heard of it, but okay, can I have some?" And I'll just play with it. I took it home, and I was just nibbling, and I used my drum, which I just started to learn how to use to do a trance and a journey, and I kept seeing in my mind eye, I kept seeing this bear of the drumming, and I was like, I don't understand. And then eventually I understood, but that's the moment where we can actually dismiss things and just subscribe to the assumption that was given to us as like, well, this doesn't mean anything, and forget about it. Or we can take the risk, if that's what we want to call it, and follow the trail, see what it means. So in my case, in this situation, there was this bear always appearing whenever I drummed and whenever I was, nibbling on these roots. So I went back to my friend and I said, like, do you know anything more about this plant? Because every time I drum and I, trying to check this place out, it always comes up with a bear. And so, oh yeah, this plant is also known as the bear root. And I was like, and then I asked who gave you this plant? And he's like, oh, and she gave me the address. And so I contacted this elder from the US. And actually her traditional name means a bear standing sacred. So I then go and visit her and did a vision quest, and a real bear actually arrived at the site where I was doing my vision quest. And so it was a big adventure and a lot of information during that process that then guided my research, but also ended up like guiding me at the time when the book needed to be, because I had no intention book. And definitely the last thing I would have written was a book like the one that I did write, because from many perspectives, that would be a career side. But I had no choice. It was like, this is the kind of relationship that we build with these others, and we honor the relationship. And I was given information that we needed respect, and I follow through. But I think that's the point. It's like there is a place for where we are invited to the wild of ourselves, to the wild side of ourselves, the unkept side of ourselves. And we have been conditioned to think that that's too scary, too dangerous, don't go there, it's the last thing that you should be doing. And yet is the very thing that will be alive. And when you are alive, then everything is alive with you. And then the conversation with plants happens. And not just with plants, but with everything. Whether it's a drumming that you need, whether deep meditation, whether it's a walk forest, whatever it is that it works for you, it doesn't really matter. The conversation is open, and these others are waiting for us. As I was sharing about the other big tree that I recently encountered, it's like they're waiting. They're waiting for us, and it's almost like we are the young, innocent species that actually doesn't realize that else is waiting for us to listen, and pretending that we are here alone. That's the madness.
So I think, thanks, Monica. It's still a bit choppy, but we can kind of make out the message even through the bad kind of audio, I think. But I think just to kind of summarize a little bit about what you were just saying there, and which kind of brings us a little bit to the introduction, this kind of idea, that was kind of inspired the project, which was that these group of humans and scientists and thinkers came together to try and embed a message inside the plant DNA to kind of warn future life organisms of kind of what we'd done, what we'd kind of screwed up on planet Earth. In a way, it's quite a pessimistic, human-centric crisis call, which sees the kind of plant in itself as a bit inert. And really what you're talking about is having this humility to see that there is already a collaborative conversation happening there, and that perhaps this idea of like saying, "Oh, humans will be extinct. What should we do?" is kind of that what you're saying, like the young kind of teenager who has got quite impatient and has decided to give up and kind of throw everything out the window and say, "I don't know what's going on." But kind of to see plants not just, but this kind of as an elder, even, this conversation has gone on much longer. I think, you spoke a little bit about time and the importance if these encounters, if we are able to make these encounters happen, that they kind of require us to operate on a very different sense of time. You're talking about telling the tree that you didn't have time, is to really kind of push back at human scale time, which in itself is kind of part of that panic about human extinction. And extinction is all very, it's all very much about seeing us as the destroyers is as equally self-centered as seeing us as the liberators.
Totally.
So with that, I'm going to read a couple of questions out from the Zoom chat. So we've got one here from Kinga Bartniak. Hello, Kinga. Dear Monica, it's a really wide question, I know, but I'm researching the idea of plants heaven. Would you have a comment how it might look like? Of course, it's a human-centered plant heaven. It's just an image. It's a humanistic concept. Maybe it's even wrong to project idea of heavens on other organisms while they may have something else we can't grasp. But I wonder how, with your knowledge, would you imagine it? I mean, I don't think of a mythology or so, rather the best place where plants could find themselves.
They already are exactly that. They are already heaven. We are the one that can't see. Plant heaven is here. It's also our own heaven. It's just that we can't see. So they don't anywhere else. We don't even project anything. That's why they're waiting for us to just wake up, see.
also got a comment from Jude. As a herbalist, I'm deeply connected with plants and have had many communication encounters with them. I've had plants call to me while searching for them. One simple method is to approach them with an open mind and ask them to communicate with you.
That's right. Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, well, that's another question just come through. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time, and it'd be great to give yourselves all a moment to kind of try and see what it feels like to try and challenge that way of seeing the natural world as the kind of backstage to the main event. And good luck with your journey on plant encounters. Thank you very much,
Thank you,
everyone.
May.
Okay,
Thank you.
goodbye.
Ciao.